started out saying, I don't want to, I'm a newspaper reporter. I help people write books. I don't want to write a book. And luckily I had a very smart friend who said, no, you need to write a book because you need it for your credibility. You're telling all these people to do this stuff that you've never done. And so I wrote my first book on how to write a book. It was more workbook-ish. It looked really good for like the year 2005. It's what we expected of books at that time is very different than what we do now. And so I then kept on improving it, writing more. And eventually that brought me to another passion project of mine, which happened to go back to what I decided when I was 8. And that was that I wanted to write about.
Join me, Jeremy Swick, on Into the Unknown, a podcast that delves into the personal journeys, stories, and experiences of individuals across diverse professions. As a historian by trade, I firmly believe that our personal histories shape our present and offer valuable insights into our paths ahead. With that being said, let's get into it. On this episode of Into the Unknown, I am joined with a very special guest, Lee K. Rogers. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
You know, I'm good. I can't complain. It's nice because it's becoming a little bit more daylight out. Where are you coming in from?
Right now, I'm in the Raleigh, North Carolina area.
Okay. I'm up here in Wisconsin. It's nice to look out and see the sun every once in a while.
We have cherry trees blooming.
I am jealous. I lived in Atlanta for a number of years, and I like that little time right before spring, right before all the pollen.
Yeah.
So I always like to kick off the show and talk about the importance of networking. How are we connected?
Olivia Atkin connected us, and she is helping me find different podcasts to talk about my work.
It's great. I really appreciate Olivia. It's funny. I feel like I talk to her several times a week, either bouncing ideas or talking about potential guests for each other. And it's just one of those things where you find people in your network and your connections. It makes to help you grow as well.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So I like to kick off the show and just talk about your origin story. Think comic book issue number 1. Who are you?
Today, I'm Lee K. Rogers, and I've only been Lee K. Rogers since about October. And I say that because that's my pen name. I decided after years of writing nonfiction, and I wrote a memoir about my family and my family's history. And then I wanted to go do what I've always dreamed of doing, which is write paranormal romance, which is also being called Romanticity these days. And my two brands weren't working together. The people who wanted to read about how to write a better book or about the history of Miami, Florida, I didn't feel that they really were going to want to read about werewolves and werewolf romance. And so I created a new brand.
It's one of those things with, as an author, it's really interesting that you mentioned that, because I think about it, and when authors sometimes do write different genres, it doesn't always mesh well. And I think it's really interesting that you've been able to kind of establish a new brand.
I'm working hard on establishing. It still doesn't come naturally to me.
I want to ask you, what got you initially into writing, and where was your interest in that?
Initially into writing, I have a very clear memory of writing in my diary at age 8 that I was going to be an author like Louisa May Alcott. She did not write paranormal romance, however, but I decided at age 8 I was going to be an author.
So it's one thing to decide to be an author at age 8. Did you just continue to write in your diary, or did you write short stories, or how did that start to happen?
I wrote a lot of stories, wrote in my diary. I was one of those people who the only thing I ever got good grades in was English. And I went through my high school poetry writing phase, which most people who are writers have a bad high school poetry writing phase. And then I got to college and found out I was a really good high school poetry writer, and I was always going to be a good high school poetry writer. And I also decided that if I wanted to be a writer, I really liked to eat on a regular basis. And that looked like becoming a newspaper reporter. So I started as a newspaper reporter because that involved writing daily and eating daily and getting a salary.
Sometimes it's combining passions, but also I think I appreciate you touching on that, because there's a reality. You do need a salary to
Yeah.
to live, frankly.
Starving artist sounds really good in a fantasy book, but reality isn't fun.
No, I can completely appreciate that. So I'm a historian by trade. So working in the museum fields last decade or so, I can completely understand of trying to keep your passion alive while also keeping yourself physically alive is no easy feat some days.
Well, at some point, I want to interview you about your work as in history and museums. That would be cool.
I could talk history all day, and I'm sure a lot like you in your writing. Did you have a variety of interests? I know, and we'll get into what you're working on currently in a bit. But did you have a variety of interests?
Well, let me say I've worked with a lot of writers. I also, the other part of what I do now is I work with authors to help them write, publish, and market their books. And so I can say with great authority that all authors are a little crazy. And it's okay for me to say that because I'm an author, so I'm a little crazy too. So yes, and authors tend to be the strange combination of ADHD introverts. So yeah, we want to jump and do everything, but we don't want to talk to people. And I think the greatest thing the pandemic did was to allow me to talk to people all over the world without ever actually having to leave my house. It's wonderful.
It really is nice, and I appreciate you saying that, because I was kind of curious with authors and historians. While we're definitely different, I know a lot of my contemporaries that are historians, sometimes a little more introverted, a little more. This would be terrifying sometimes for them, and it's funny for me because my background was education before that, and so I tell people, once you go in front of a classroom of kids, you can literally talk to anyone. No one else is going to be scarier than a bunch of seventh graders.
Oh yeah. Maybe a bunch of kindergartners, but yeah.
Absolutely. When did you start writing your first book?
Well, I started. I was working in newspapers. I started editing. People would ask me to edit their books, and I would see all these great books that I had edited, just having, they couldn't get an agent or they couldn't get a publisher, and they just sat. And then Amazon came along and changed the publishing world, maybe for the better, maybe not. We'll have that discussion another time. But I had a friend who wanted me to help her write a book. It was a biography. It was all about her life, very, narrative about her life and her marriage. And at the end of writing it, she said she decided to self-publish. And I said, well, I don't know much about that. I will research it and we'll have a talk. And I did. And I came back all enthusiastic. And she said, well, wait, I've decided I don't really want to publish a book. Writing this book has made me realize what I want is a divorce. So she got a divorce and I started a business.
It's crazy how things like that happen. Especially, did you envision yourself creating a business, or was this originally just to help out a friend?
I was already a freelance writer at that point. When my son was born, I quit working in an office and was doing freelance writing from home, and I made a goal that I would never have to go back to an office and have a boss again. And so it It doesn't look anything like I envisioned at the time, and I won't tell you how long that is. But yeah, it's worked out. I have now a lot of bosses because all my clients are my bosses. So
That's the one thing I don't think they always tell you about starting a business is you go
yeah, but
from
I
boss
get to fire them.
exactly.
It's really bad. So.
It is nice, and I appreciate you saying that because one of the great things about working with clients is you can start. Of course, I don't know about you, but when I first started, it was like if you have a pulse, you're going to pay me. All right,
Yes.
you're now my client.
Yes.
As it evolves, it's nice to be able to start choosing who you vibe with, who you match with, and it's just kind of great.
Yeah, and you get those vibes of not this one, and then sometimes they fool you, and they're either really nice or they really they seemed nice, and you really shouldn't have done it. But
So it's all part of that experience. So you start writing, you start publishing books. How many books have you written so far?
well, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I've got 7 here, and there's a couple of others I've published. There's 2 that I published that aren't here, and then I've done some second editions of a couple of my how to write a book books, and so somewhere in the neighborhood of a dozen.
Oh wow.
Mm-hmm.
What was your first book like and what was that experience?
Well, let me say I started out saying I don't want to. I'm a newspaper reporter. I help people write books. I don't want to write a book. And luckily, I had a very smart friend who said, no, you need to write a book because you need it for your credibility. You're telling all these people to do this stuff that you've never done. And so I wrote my first book on how to write a book. It was more workbookish. Looked really good for like the year 2005. It's what we expected of books at that time is very different than what we do now. And so I then kept on improving it, writing more. And eventually that brought me to another passion project of mine, which happened to go back to what I decided when I was 8. And that was that I wanted to write about my family. And I come from Miami, Florida, and my family, Miami is a very young city. It's a little over 100 years old. And my great-grandfather was the engineer on the first train to drive into Miami. Although, as my mother always said, unfortunately, he didn't own the train. He just drove it. And so that didn't get us much. But I grew up with all these stories of a time that no longer existed. And so I wanted to write that. So I wrote it, and it's called Hibiscus Strong. And it is all about Miami from the 1890s up through 1940s. And it's nonfiction, but it's written in a fictional style. Each chapter is its own short story. And that gave me the courage to start writing more fiction and feeling that I actually did understand how to craft a fictional story. Plus, I'd been editing a lot of fiction. So, I felt like I was finally ready to start writing fiction. And so I went back to origins. My sister and I loved everything from Grimm's fairy tales on. We read Lord of the Rings long before it was a movie. I have a collection of Wizard of Oz. Did you know that there were a lot of there's like 32 Wizard of Oz books? I have about 20.
I'm learning that. I learned that not too long ago. I found it fascinating.
Yes. Yeah. And they're all great. And I've started reading and watching anything that was fantasy, supernatural, from the time I was old enough not to be too scared by it, and still love it.
Well, that's amazing. One thing I want to say, I appreciate you saying only 100 years isn't that old, and as a historian, you're completely right in the sense of it's just a little blip in time. Sometimes people ask me about, whatever's going on in the world. I'm like, this is such a nanosecond of the grander story of not just the United States, but kind of world history as well. So I found that
Yeah, it
really
is. It
interesting.
is. This is, and then you go to Williamsburg, Virginia, and you see all these old buildings, and then you go to Europe, and you're like, oh yeah,
Oh,
we had this and thought it was great, and they had that even earlier.
absolutely. And then you go too far back, they're talking about how great the old stuff was back in when the Coliseum was built, or things like
Yes,
that. It's
yes.
always interesting. I think so much of it's a perspective though as well.
Yeah, it is. It is. And but anyway, that's how I. So yes, also a love of history, and so
So tell me a little bit more about your, once you start writing, you start getting into fiction. Was this your first, the book we're going to talk about, is that your first fiction book?
that is my first fiction book, other than the short stories I was required to write in high school. I am a Karen is a nonfiction writer. Lee is a fiction writer. So again, split personality. That's me.
I love it. I think, on everyone's journey, there's a chance you can go east, a chance you can go west. You kind of make a decision and just go for it. Can you give me an example of that?
As I said, I I had a child, and I decided that chasing fire engines at 4 a.m. and breastfeeding did not go together well. So I quit and became a stay-at-home mom. But I am also very used to multitasking. And so even while I was a stay-at-home mom, I started freelancing. And I loved being my own boss. And I just decided that I never wanted to have another boss and go into an office again. So I became a work-at-home person long before it became popular. I was a pioneer, and when everyone else moved home in 2020, I'm like, what's the problem? I've been doing this for decades. And, so yeah.
That's great. What are you working on right now?
Well, I will show you the two books that I have just published. This one came out in October. It's called The Hunter's Moon. The Artificial Witch, which is book 2, came out February 11th, and I am now working on number 3 in this series. It's going to be called The Wolf Revealed. And it's about a small town in Kentucky that's very much based. I used to live in Evansville, Indiana. I've lived a lot of places. Evansville, Indiana, Henderson, Kentucky are on either side of the Ohio River. So I've called this town Rewrote, Kentucky, because that would translate to vaguely to Wolf River, and very loosely based on Evansville and Henderson. But in this town, there are werewolves and witches, and the chief of police happens to be a siren. He's from Jamaica, and there's vampires, and there are also normal, non-paras, as they call them, the normal people, and they have no idea about what's going on in the background. They have no idea that this guy who's just been murdered in the park was killed by a werewolf. And they have no idea that their friends might be witches. And so I'm just having a lot of fun with it.
That's amazing. I'm curious. When you wrote the book, you said that's book 3. When you started this journey of writing those books, did you have 3 books in mind, or 4, or how did that unfold?
I literally dreamed the first book. I woke up and had this full story in my head. and quickly took notes on it. And then it took me a few years to get to the point where I was ready to write it down, but it was always there in the back of my head. And so that one was really easy because I really knew, it came to me as a whole. And then as I was writing it, I realized that one of the main characters' sister needed her own story. She needed her own happily ever after. And so I had to create a story for her. And then I realized one of these other characters, I'm now totally hooked on writing about these people. And the other thing is, as somebody who's worked in book publishing for a long time, the best way to sell book 1 is to write book 2. And the best way to sell book 2 is to write book 3. So I'm going to keep on going.
I love that. I love that. So if people want to learn more about you, where they can pick up the books, where can they find you online?
Okay, they can find me online at my website, which is leekrogers.author.com, Instagram, Blue Sky, and Facebook as both Karen and Lee. So, and LinkedIn, and I try to not do anything else because you could spend your life doing social media.
Oh, trust me, I know.
Yeah, I'm sure you do.
Well, Lee, I wanted to say thank you so much, and we'll make sure to link that in the show notes as well. But I really appreciate you taking the time. I'm excited. I'm definitely going to pick up the book because, the 3 books, because now I am very curious.
Okay, well, the third one won't be out until July. I'm only halfway through it. I'm not quite sure how it's going to end. But you can find both of my books on Amazon. So
awesome. Well, thank you and take care.
Okay, thank you.
Fun episode of Into the Unknown. I truly appreciate you taking the time to listen. And if it provides you any value or entertainment, I would love if you shared it with others, liked, subscribed, and really just help the podcast grow. Again, tell a friend, tell a foe, just anyone who might enjoy hearing some stories of people's own journeys and what got them to where they are today. Till next time.